So today's SAT video with Coach Fred is about semicolons and colons. These are some topics I've already gone over, but I thought a nice quick review might help. So now remember, when we're dealing on the writing section of the SAT, the most important question you can ask yourself is, when you look at a question, is what am I being tested on? If you ask yourself that and then follow the rules on the types of questions that I have suggested, then they do become easier. And remember, if you've seen any of my previous videos on the writing section, I've kind of broken them down into 7 categories of questions that you'd be tested on, one being punctuation. Okay, but today we're going to talk about semicolons and colons. So if you, to know about semicolons and colons and what to do with them, you have to know the difference between an independent clause and a dependent clause. So an independent clause, again, is a group of words that contains a subject and a verb and expresses a complete thought. Just remember that if the above is true, then an independent clause would be a sentence. So you want this, it's got to be a complete thought. Whereas a dependent clause is a group of words that can contain a subject and a verb, but does not express a complete thought. So it's not a sentence. It's not something that makes sense. So when I am trying to decide if it's a dependent clause, if I'm unsure, I look for words that they call dependent marker words. These words that we have gone over, like after, although, as if, because, whatever, whenever. So this list of words, if I see them, they basically tell me I've got a dependent clause. So I definitely think about that. All right, so why is that important? Well, it's important because the most important thing you have to know about semicolons is that they are used to separate 2 complete thoughts, so meaning 2 independent clauses. You should be able to replace the semicolon with a period and have 2 complete sentences. So let's look at an incorrect and correct version. Because Mark is my brother, semicolon, he knew where I lived. Well, because Mark is my brother, number 1 has that dependent clause marker. Because, and it is not a complete thought. It can't stand alone as a sentence. So that semicolon could not be used. I could make a change to the sentence and make it, Mark is my brother, getting rid of that dependent marker, and he knew where I lived. And then I could use that semicolon in between them. All right, so what do I like to think of? Be sure for semicolons that you have independent clause, semicolon, independent clause. If you have that, then a semicolon can be used. If you don't, it's out. All right, so let's move on to colons. Colons also can connect to independent clauses, but are usually used to introduce lists and explanations or an identifying phrase. Okay, now here's the good part. Colons must come after a complete sentence or an independent clause, but can then introduce a list or introduce an explanation or identifying phrase. So that's really good because then I know I've got independent clause, colon, and then either a list or explanation. So I can use it in that case as well. Now the good news is you'll never have to decide between 2 punctuation marks that perform the same purpose. So if one's wrong, they're both wrong. All right, let's look at some examples. So here's our first example. I, number 1, look at it and it says, I can tell by the answers that I'm being tested on punctuation because all the words are the same. The only difference is that I've got different punctuation. All right, so I'm tested on punctuation, so I have to think commas, semicolons, and colons. Okay. I, number 1, read the sentence, but they suggest that the presence of otters provides a good model of how carbon can be sequestered or removed. Okay, so I see a semicolon. I also see that dependent word marker, but, and I can see that that's not a complete thought before, and also it's not a complete thought after. So A is out. Okay, now I know that that sequestered comma is part of it. So there's a comma, and then I notice that afterwards, what I have going on is or removed. So or removed is an identifying phrase. It's like a positive. It's a descriptive phrase that doesn't include a subject or a verb. So that means appositives could be taken out and not change the meaning of the sentence. So I test that. And I say a good model of how carbon can be sequestered from the atmosphere through the management of animal populations. So or removed is is in a positive, and so it has to be surrounded by commas. So I look and I see or removed, and so my answer would be D. Again, I did want to get rid of that semicolon first, okay? Here's another example. Number 14. Now I look at it very carefully and I see that I'm being tested on punctuation. Number 1, I'm being tested on the commas, colons, and semicolons, but I'm also being tested on its and the apostrophe. So I can see that I've got its, and it's with the apostrophe, so it is. So I look at number 14, and actually these for some reason got misnumbered, so it's right there. It took me by surprise then when my favorite exhibit at the museum was one of its tiniest, the Thorn miniature rooms. So number 1, I know I can't use a semicolon because the Thorn miniature rooms is not a complete thought. Remember, a semicolon has to go between 2 independent clauses. So I can get rid of A and B. So I don't even have to worry about the its in these cases. So then the question becomes its tiniest and its tiniest. So number 1, I looked at the colon and the comma. I could use the colon and I could use the comma. So it came down to, do I need the apostrophe? And in this case, it's a conjunction. It is tiniest would not be the use. So I would not be using the comma. I'd be using the colon. And a colon, because it's a complete thought before it, this is that identifying phrase that comes next. So my answer would be C. So you can see that using the rules helps you eliminate a lot of the answers. All right, so just remember those 2 rules for semicolons and colons, and you should be able to get all of these SAT problems right on the writing section. Have a great day.